In the icy winter of 1864, a shocking discovery shook the Montana frontier to its core. Vigilantes stormed the cabin of the man sworn to protect them, Sheriff Henry Plummer, and uncovered a secret that would haunt the American West forever. Beneath the floorboards, they found maps marking gold shipment routes, belongings of missing travelers, and a ledger listing 102 victims. What they were about to expose was not just a murderer, but the mastermind of one of the most sophisticated criminal networks in frontier history. But before we dive into this chilling tale, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell, because this is where we uncover America's darkest and most mysterious stories. And in the comments, let me know where you're watching from. I love connecting with fellow history and horror fans across the country. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Bannack City, 1862. Gold changed everything. When prospector John White struck gold along Grasshopper Creek, Bannack City exploded overnight. What was once wilderness became a booming mining camp of nearly 4,000 people. Crude log cabins, tents, and muddy streets were soon crowded with saloons, gambling halls, and merchants eager to profit from fortune seekers. But with gold came chaos. The U.S. government, far away in Washington, D.C., could barely maintain control. In these lawless lands, sheriffs and deputies carried more power than anyone else. The problem: few honest men wanted the job. It was dangerous, thankless, and often attracted drifters, ex-soldiers, and men with questionable pasts. It was in this atmosphere that a tall, well-spoken stranger arrived in Bannack, Henry Plummer. The rise of Henry Plummer. Plummer stood out from the rough miners. At 31, he was tall, lean, well-groomed, and carried himself like a man of authority. He claimed to have been a lawman in California and Nevada. He spoke with calm authority, wore clean clothes, and seemed like exactly the kind of man the frightened citizens needed to restore order. When the talk of appointing a sheriff for Bannack began, Plummer's name was on everyone's lips. Merchants vouched for him, citizens admired him, and local leaders believed he was their answer to the rising violence. But what no one knew was Plummer's dark past. In California, he had been arrested multiple times for assault and even suspected murder. He had fled west after a rival, who had been courting the same woman as him, was found mysteriously dead. Still, in Montana Territory, far from civilization and communication, his past remained hidden. And so, Henry Plummer was sworn in as sheriff of Bannack City in late 1862. Gold, greed, and fear. Life in Bannack revolved around gold. Miners would haul their fortunes in leather sacks, traveling through hundreds of miles of wilderness to deposit them or buy supplies. These routes were dangerous and predictable, perfect for an ambush. By the winter of 1862, travelers began vanishing. At first, people blamed the wilderness, wild animals, native tribes, or weather. But soon, the pattern was undeniable. Armed men, experienced in the frontier, were disappearing without a trace. Fear spread. Miners who struck it rich were too terrified to leave town. Merchants couldn't get goods in or gold out. And despite the government's promise of patrols, no one was safe. Sheriff Henry Plummer stepped in as the community's savior. He promised to organize patrols, secure routes, and restore order. The town celebrated his appointment, believing they finally had protection. But what they didn't know was that the man sworn to protect them was the very reason they were afraid. The first victim, January 1863. A respected merchant, Thomas Caldwell, prepared for the dangerous journey to Salt Lake City. He carried nearly $8,000 in gold dust, a fortune. Known as a careful man, he traveled with 2 armed guards. As always, he reported his travel plans to Sheriff Plummer before leaving. Caldwell's route and timing were recorded in Plummer's log. The sheriff even promised to send deputies if Caldwell didn't arrive safely. But Caldwell never reached the first way station. Neither did his guards. A week later, Deputy Buck Stinson, one of Plummer's hand-picked men, led the search. They found traces of the group, ashes from a fire, horse tracks, food scraps. Then, 30 miles out, the trail vanished. Finally, hidden deep in the pines, searchers uncovered a shallow grave. Inside were the bodies of Caldwell and his 2 guards. Each had been executed with a bullet to the back of the head. Their horses, weapons, and gold were gone. This wasn't a random robbery. The killers had stripped the bodies, removed all valuables, and left strange carvings on nearby trees, symbols the searchers didn't recognize. Sheriff Plummer arrived quickly, examined the scene with care, and promised justice. His calm, professional demeanor reassured the townsfolk. But what no one realized was how expertly he misdirected the investigation, steering attention away from key evidence. A sheriff's secret. Behind the scenes, Plummer had created something far more sinister than random robberies. He had built a criminal empire, a gang later known as the Innocents, a network of deputies, riders, and spies who controlled the roads, ambushed shipments, and eliminated anyone who posed a threat. Every disappearance, every robbery, every murder was planned. And all of it was orchestrated by the very man the people trusted to keep them safe. The citizens of Bannack had unknowingly handed law and order to a predator. And his reign of terror was only just beginning. Right finger end of part 1. If you found this story chilling, don't miss part 2, where we dive deeper into how Plummer's secret gang spread its influence across the Montana territory. And remember, subscribe, like, and share this video so more people can discover the dark side of America's Wild West. Part 2: The Sheriff's Mask of Justice. Hook. Imagine sitting in a packed church on a cold Sunday morning, the air heavy with fear. Every face in that room is pale, every man clutching his hat with nervous hands. The sheriff, your only hope for protection, stands before you with words of courage. But what if, behind that badge, behind that calm voice, lurks the very mastermind of the terror you're facing? That was the hidden truth in Bannack, Montana, 1863. And no one, not a single miner, merchant, or family in that church, had any idea. The gathering at the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church was the largest building in Bannack, a place usually reserved for prayer and worship. But on this grim Sunday, it became a war council. Sheriff Henry Plummer stood tall at the front, the morning light falling across his face, giving him the appearance of a man chosen by God himself. He spoke of danger, robbers, killers, and shadows haunting the mountain trails. His words painted pictures of blood-soaked snow, broken wagons, and the cries of murdered travelers. People shivered as he spoke, yet they also felt reassured. Their sheriff wasn't ignoring the threat, he was confronting it. Plummer promised action. He would expand his deputies, set up informants, and make sure no criminal could hide in their town. He urged the merchants to travel in groups, to share information, to trust their lawmen. By the time the meeting ended, people were whispering to each other, "Plummer is the man we can count on. He'll protect us." No one suspected that the very devil they feared was standing right before them, smiling. A perfect cover. The truth was chilling. Henry Plummer wasn't just investigating the crimes. He was orchestrating them. Every robbery, every disappearance followed a pattern. The victims were always men carrying gold. The ambushes happened on routes the sheriff knew well. And almost every victim's travel plans had been shared with Plummer himself. It was the perfect cover. As sheriff, Plummer had access to secrets no criminal could ever dream of. He was both the protector and the predator. By spring of 1863, Bannack was suffocating under fear. Letters poured into Washington, D.C., begging for soldiers. Miners melted gold into rough bricks, hiding them under floorboards rather than risk a trip to town. Some simply abandoned their claims and left Montana altogether. And through it all, Sheriff Plummer rode hard across the territory, his face stern, his voice steady, convincing everyone he was fighting for them. In reality, every ride was a scouting mission, every interview a way to gather intelligence for his gang. The master of deception. Plummer's genius wasn't just in his cruelty, but in his patience. He used the law itself as his weapon. He could stop travelers, question them, even demand to know how much gold they carried. No one dared refuse. He could deputize criminals, call them lawmen, and no one blinked an eye. And when the bodies appeared, Guess who was in charge of the investigation? Sheriff Plummer himself. The fox was guarding the henhouse, and no one in Bannack could see it. But there was a problem, a deadly one. His empire was growing too large. What began as a handful of killers had swelled into a network of dozens, spreading across the territory. With size came risk, mistakes, loose ends. And in the summer of 1863, the first loose end appeared. The survivor. In July, a man staggered into Virginia City, bleeding and half dead. His name was James Romaine, a trader from Salt Lake City. He told a story that froze men's blood. He and his two companions had been ambushed near Beaverhead Rock. His friends were shot dead instantly, but Romaine, wounded in the shoulder, had tumbled into a creek bed. Hidden by rocks and water, he watched as the killers searched the bodies. But Romaine wasn't just another victim. He had seen faces. He had heard voices. He swore that one of the attackers was none other than George Ives, a man known in every mining camp as one of Sheriff Plummer's trusted informants. The whispers began. How could a sheriff's informant be mixed up in cold-blooded murder? The sheriff's game of lies. When Romaine's testimony spread, the people expected outrage. And Sheriff Plummer delivered. He rushed to Romaine's side, notebook in hand, asking questions, nodding with grave concern. He announced a warrant for George Ives. He formed a posse. He promised justice. But behind his cold eyes, Plummer knew the truth. George Ives had broken the cardinal rule. He had let a witness live. Now, Ives wasn't just a problem, he was a threat to the entire operation. The manhunt was real, but its true purpose wasn't to arrest Ives. It was to find him before anyone else did. A captured Ives could destroy everything. For 3 long months, the Montana frontier buzzed with the chase. Rewards were offered, posses formed in every camp. And somehow, Ives always slipped away, aided by sympathizers hidden across the territory. But even a fox can't outrun the hunt forever. And with Ives on the run, cracks were forming in the mask Henry Plummer wore so perfectly. The sheriff's empire of blood was beginning to tremble. Sparkles. End of part 2. Sparkles. Right finger. Would you like me to continue shaping part 3 in the same hook right pointing arrow build up right pointing arrow shocking twist format so the whole 10-part story feels like a seamless Netflix style series for YouTube? Part 3. The Sheriff's Secret. Hook. Imagine living in a small mining town where gold dust filled the air, but so did whispers of death. Every traveler on the road knew one wrong turn could mean never coming back. Now, imagine the very man sworn to protect you, the sheriff himself, might actually be the monster hunting you. That was the chilling reality facing the people of Virginia City in 1863. The longer the chase for outlaw George Ives continued, the stranger things began to look. How could one of the most wanted criminals in Montana territory vanish so easily in such a wide, empty land? At first, people blamed the wilderness, the weather, or sheer bad luck. But as weeks passed, the truth began to creep in like a shadow. Something wasn't adding up. Merchants started talking. Miners began comparing notes. Stories of Sheriff Henry Plummer's odd behavior began to surface. Why was he always asking travelers about their plans? Why were his deputies so often missing whenever an attack happened? And why, despite all his apparent hard work, were there never any real arrests? By October of 1863, suspicion had boiled over. A respected Virginia City merchant named William Plummer had had enough. Too many friends were robbed. Too much gold was lost. Too many lives were ruined. The sheriff, the man paid to keep the peace, wasn't solving anything. So Plummer and a small group of businessmen decided to take matters into their own hands. They formed a secret citizens group called the Committee of Vigilantes. Now, committees like this weren't unusual on the frontier. Law was often weak, courts slow, and sheriffs sometimes corrupt. But what made this group different was who they were. Not drunken mobs with torches, but educated, determined men with wealth, influence, and a hunger for justice. At first, their suspicions pointed only toward corruption. Maybe Sheriff Plummer was taking bribes, or maybe he was too cowardly to face the outlaws. But as they dug deeper, the truth became far darker. They began interviewing survivors of robberies, not through the sheriff's office, but in secret. James Romaine, who had barely escaped with his life, told his story again. When the vigilantes compared his words with other attacks, the pattern became clear: these weren't random bandits. Someone was feeding them information, choosing the targets, and coordinating the strikes with military precision. The more evidence they gathered, the closer one name kept rising to the surface. Sheriff Henry Plummer. The breakthrough came in November. John Bozeman, another committee member, captured a man named Red Yeager, a known outlaw tied to George Ives. Unlike past captures, Yeager wasn't handed to the sheriff. Instead, the vigilantes kept him hidden. They interrogated him directly, using methods far more clever and persistent than anything official law enforcement tried. At first, Yeager resisted. But when the questioning grew more intense, he broke. What spilled from his lips shocked every man in the room. The robberies weren't random. They were the work of a vast criminal organization, over 30 men spread across the territory. And the gang even had a name: the Innocents. It sounded almost like a cruel joke, because they were anything but innocent. They struck with the discipline of soldiers. They had coded messages, signal fires on ridges, and maps of every gold route in Montana. Every ambush was carefully planned, every escape mapped out in advance. But the most terrifying revelation was still to come. According to Yeager, the Innocents' leader wasn't some outlaw hiding in a mountain cave. Their leader, the mastermind, was none other than Sheriff Henry Plummer himself. And their headquarters, the basement of the Bannack Sheriff's office, the very heart of the law. The vigilantes sat in stunned silence. If Yeager was telling the truth, then the entire legal system in Bannack was rotten to the core. The sheriff, his deputies, and even respected citizens were all in on it. Yeager gave names: deputies loyal to Plummer, merchants who quietly supplied the gang, citizens who spied for them. He even described Plummer's cold efficiency, how the sheriff himself sometimes rode with the gang, personally disarming victims under the pretense of law, before executing them without hesitation. It wasn't just robbery, it was terrorism, a campaign of fear to control the entire region. Now the Vigilance Committee faced a nightmare of their own. What could they do with this knowledge? If they went public, Plummer's men might strike first, wiping out witnesses. If they waited, more travelers would die. Some men, like Wilbur Sanders, a sharp young lawyer from Ohio, argued for patience. Build the case. Gather more evidence. Make sure every accusation could be proved beyond doubt. But others, like Plummer, felt delay meant death. Every day Plummer wore his badge was another day the Innocents could kill again. The tension grew, and soon, fate forced their hand. In December 1863, outlaw George Ives was finally captured alive near the Stinking Water River. A posse of volunteers, not just deputies, brought him to Nevada City. When Sheriff Plummer demanded custody, the citizens refused. They had seen too much, lost too many friends. For the first time, the people openly challenged their own sheriff. Crowds gathered. Citizens from mining camps across Montana poured in. What began as a simple prisoner handover turned into something much larger, a mass meeting of outraged people determined to expose the truth. As they shared their stories, piece by piece, a horrifying puzzle came together. The misleading horseshoes, the strange purchases of ammunition, the delayed telegraphs, all threads of the same web. And at the center of that web sat Sheriff Henry Plummer. By the time George Ives was placed on trial under the freezing Montana sky, everyone knew this was more than a case about one outlaw. This was about the entire Innocents gang. About corruption so deep it poisoned the very idea of law. The trial became a symbol, a choice between continuing to trust a broken system or taking justice into their own hands. As lanterns flickered and breath turned to mist in the December night, the people of Montana made their choice. The age of innocence was over. Right Finger Part 4 will reveal how George Ives' trial lit the spark that turned ordinary citizens into executioners, and how the people of Montana prepared to bring down Sheriff Plummer himself. Would you like me to make each part end with a strong horror-style cliffhanger line, so viewers are pulled into the next episode automatically? Part 4: The Sheriff's Shadow. Hook. What would you do if the very man sworn to protect you was the monster you feared most? In Montana's frozen wilderness of 1863, this question was no longer just rumor, it was a terrifying reality. Sheriff Henry Plummer, once hailed as the Law of Bannack, was now whispered about in the taverns and mining camps as the leader of a secret brotherhood of killers. And the people were about to find out just how far his reach truly went. The unmasking begins. The trial of George Ives had changed everything. For years, suspicion and fear had lingered in the mining towns, but there had been no proof, just whispers in the dark. Now, with testimony from both Ives and Red Yeager, a horrifying truth had been dragged into the cold Montana light. The innocents were no gang of stragglers or highway thugs. They were an organized empire of death. And at the top of it all, was Sheriff Henry Plummer. The revelations sent waves of dread through Virginia City and Bannack. Ordinary miners looked over their shoulders, unsure if their closest neighbor was secretly a member. Merchants wondered if the men they sold supplies to by day would come for their gold by night. A shadow hung over the entire territory, and every shadow carried Plummer's face. But terror wasn't the only thing stirring. Anger was building too. Whispers in the taverns. Inside the smoky saloons, whispers turned into plans. Men slammed their mugs on wooden tables, swearing that enough was enough. "We've lost friends, gold, and freedom," one miner spat. "If the law is the outlaw, then we'll make our own law." But even as men spoke boldly in groups, fear followed them home. Everyone knew Plummer had ears everywhere. Deputies loyal to him walked freely, collecting information and passing it back to their leader. It was said that even the walls of Bannack's sheriff's office could talk, so many plots had been overheard there. And so, the Vigilance Committee decided to act in secret. The Vigilantes, oath. William Palmer and Wilbur Sanders gathered men they trusted into barns, basements, and hidden back rooms. Lantern light flickered over tense faces as one by one, they swore an oath. To protect the innocent, to fight corruption, and to stand as justice when justice has failed. They were businessmen, miners, blacksmiths, and teachers, ordinary men pushed to extraordinary measures. But what made this group terrifying to their enemies was not their numbers, but their resolve. They were done waiting. Each meeting ended with the same haunting reminder whispered by Palmer. "Speak of this to no one. If the innocents learn of our plans, we won't live to see justice done." Plummer's cold smile. Sheriff Plummer, meanwhile, played his role to perfection. To the unsuspecting, he was the charming, capable lawman, striding down Bannack's muddy streets with a confident smile and a badge shining on his chest. To those in his inner circle, he was something else entirely, a calculating mastermind who decided life and death with the flick of a hand. His deputies adored him, but not out of loyalty. It was fear. They knew that crossing Plummer meant vanishing into the night, your body later discovered riddled with bullets or left to freeze in the mountain snow. One story whispered that Plummer once rode out with his men, chasing a miner accused of cheating the gang. When they caught him, Plummer himself tied the noose and made the man's best friend pull the rope. That friend never spoke of it again. A territory gripped by horror. The winter of 1863 was brutal, not just in weather but in blood. Snow blanketed the trails, hiding tracks of murder and robbery. Stagecoaches carrying gold dust disappeared. Travelers were found stripped and frozen in the gulches. And always, when survivors were questioned, there was the same haunting detail. Sheriff Plummer had been suspiciously absent, or his deputies had arrived too late, always too late. Miners began to say it openly, "The sheriff rides with the innocents." But saying it too loud could get you killed. The turning point. The Vigilance Committee knew time was running out. If they didn't act soon, Plummer would discover them. They decided to test their strength with small actions, quietly capturing known innocents one by one. In December, a drunken gang member named Ned Ray was cornered in a tavern. Instead of handing him to the sheriff, the Vigilantes took him in secret. That night, in a barn lit only by lanterns, Ned Ray confessed details that matched everything Yeager and Ives had revealed. The Vigilantes realized something chilling. The innocents weren't just robbers. They were executioners. Lists of names were kept, and anyone who crossed them was marked for death. The territory wasn't lawless, it was ruled by Plummer's law, the law of fear. Horror in the basement. One former deputy, too frightened to give his name, told the Vigilantes a story that still chilled their blood. He claimed Plummer used the basement of the Bannack sheriff's office as his headquarters. Down there, in the damp and darkness, maps of gold routes were spread across tables. Names of targets were written in Plummer's own hand. But worse still, some nights, men were brought into that basement alive, only to never walk out again. Their screams, muffled by the sheriff's stone walls, haunted the deputy's memory forever. It wasn't just crime, it was ritualized terror. A community at war. By January 1864, Montana's mining camps were no longer united towns but boiling cauldrons of fear and suspicion. Every man looked at his neighbor and wondered, innocent or innocent? The Vigilantes decided the time for secrecy was ending. They would confront Plummer head-on. But they also knew this wasn't just about justice anymore, it was survival. If they failed, Plummer and his men would wipe them out, one by one. Meetings grew louder, angrier, more desperate. Sanders argued for legal structure, a trial, evidence. But others demanded swift execution. A rattlesnake doesn't get a trial, one miner shouted. You kill it before it kills you. The debate was fierce, but the conclusion was clear. Sheriff Henry Plummer had to fall. Cliffhanger ending. On a bitter January night, under a sky heavy with snow, the Vigilance Committee gathered their rifles and prepared to ride into Bannack. Horses stamped nervously, clouds of frost rising in the cold. Every man knew that before dawn, blood would be spilled, either theirs or Plummer's. The sheriff still walked free, smiling that cold smile. But the noose was already waiting. And as the Vigilantes mounted their horses, one thought bound them all together. Tonight, the lawless will meet the law. Checkmark Part 5 will tell the terrifying showdown between Plummer's innocence and the Vigilance Committee, where justice and horror collide in the snowy streets of Bannack. Do you want me to make Part 5 more like a battle-style horror climax with lots of suspense and action, or keep it courtroom-style with grim historical details like a trial of the innocents? Part 5: The Gallows at Bannack. Hook. Imagine this. The town's sheriff, the very man who carried the badge of law, now standing beneath the same noose he had once ordered for others. Snow fell silently that January night in 1864, but the streets of Bannack echoed with the heavy steps of men who had decided, justice would no longer wait. The Vigilantes ride. The Vigilance Committee was no longer a secret circle of whispers. By now, they were an army. Nearly 200 men rode through the frozen night, rifles on their backs, lanterns swinging in the dark. Their mission was clear. Sheriff Henry Plummer, the lawman turned outlaw, must face judgment. The sound of hooves echoed through the gulches, a thunder that made the miners wake in fear. Dogs barked. Children peeked through frosted windows. Mothers pulled them back, whispering, "Stay inside." Tonight, Bannack changes forever. Plummer's last drink. Inside the sheriff's office, Henry Plummer sat by a small fire, his badge catching the light. He was drinking, calm as ever, when the Vigilantes surrounded the building. A deputy rushed in, breathless. "Sheriff, they're coming." The whole town, armed. Plummer didn't flinch. He looked into the flames and muttered, almost to himself, "So. It's finally come." Then, with a cold smile, he stood, slipped his pistol into its holster, and adjusted the star badge on his chest. Outside, voices shouted for him to surrender. The fire cracked. The sheriff did not run. The capture. When the Vigilantes stormed in, Plummer raised his hands slowly. His calmness unsettled them more than resistance would have. His eyes, dark and calculating, swept over the men as if memorizing each face. "You think you're the law now?" he said softly, almost mockingly. "When the snow melts, you'll wish you had never crossed me." His deputies were dragged out too, cursing and spitting. The men of Bannack watched from their windows as their sheriff was marched through the snow, his boots crunching loudly, his breath steady. It wasn't just an arrest, it was an unmasking. The horror of the innocents. Before the noose, confessions poured like blood. Deputies, once bold, now begged for mercy. They admitted to murders along the trails, stagecoach robberies, ambushes in the gulches. They spoke of Plummer's orders, how he chose the victims, how his basement had been the council chamber of death. One vigilante later swore that the deputies wept like children, each revealing darker horrors than the last. "We buried them in shallow graves," one man sobbed. "Sometimes not even buried, just left for the wolves." The crowd shuddered. Mothers clutched their children tighter. The night air seemed colder with every word. And still, Henry Plummer said nothing. The gallows built in silence. The vigilantes wasted no time. In Bannack, the old gallows stood like a skeleton of wood against the snowy sky. Lanterns were hung, their glow throwing long, twisted shadows across the frozen ground. The people gathered in silence, their breath clouds in the winter air. No music, no prayer, only the creak of rope and the crunch of boots. The deputies were led up first. One by one, they begged for forgiveness. One by one, the ropes tightened. Their gasps cut short, their bodies swaying like broken marionettes. Children hid their faces. Wives turned away. Yet none left. This was no mere hanging, this was exorcism. The sheriff faces the rope. At last, it was Henry Plummer's turn. The man who had once ruled Bannack with charm and fear now stood beneath the noose. His coat was dusted with snow, his hands bound. The badge, stripped from his chest, lay in the dirt at his feet. For the first time, the calm mask cracked. His voice, sharp and desperate, rang out. "Gentlemen, hear me. You've been misled. I was no leader of them. I swore to uphold the law. Give me a trial, a fair trial." But the vigilantes had heard enough lies, seen enough blood. The crowd murmured, "No trial. Justice." Plummer's eyes darted from face to face, searching for pity. None came. His last plea. They placed the rope around his neck. The sheriff, the man once feared by all, trembled at last. "My God," he whispered, "please don't do this, don't kill me like a dog." Some say he offered to reveal hidden caches of gold if they spared him. Others claim he cursed the vigilantes, swearing their children would suffer for what they had done. Whatever his last words, the rope answered louder. The beam creaked. The trap was sprung. Sheriff Henry Plummer swung in the Montana night. The silence after. When the body stilled, the crowd remained in silence. Snow fell heavier, muffling the sound of the wind. The badge of Bannack's sheriff lay half buried in the frost, a symbol of law twisted into betrayal. One miner whispered, "The devil's sheriff is gone." Another added, "But the devil's work will haunt these hills forever." No one disagreed. The horror lives on. In the weeks that followed, the vigilantes hunted down every remaining innocent. Some were dragged from cabins, others from stagecoaches. Trails were littered with shallow graves. The noose worked overtime, and Bannack was drowned in both justice and blood. But still, the stories grew darker. Miners swore that on stormy nights, they saw a figure on horseback, tall, with a star badge shining faintly in the lightning. Others claimed the sheriff's office basement still echoed with muffled screams, though the place was long abandoned. Even years later, travelers through Bannack whispered, "Don't walk the streets at night. The sheriff still watches." Closing cliffhanger. Henry Plummer's body may have rotted beneath the earth, but his legend only grew. Was he truly the mastermind of the innocents, or a scapegoat for crimes committed by many? The snow kept its secrets. And Bannack, forever cursed by its sheriff, remained a town where law and horror were carved into the very soil. Checkmark Part 6 will reveal the chilling aftermath, the vigilantes, justice, the unanswered questions, and the ghostly curse that still lingers in Montana's haunted ghost towns. Do you want me to write Part 6 more like a supernatural horror ending, Ghost of Plummer haunting Bannack, or a historic horror ending, Grim Aftermath, vigilante justice spilling into paranoia? Part 6: The Curse of the Vigilantes. Hook. The sheriff was dead. His deputies dangled beside him. Bannack should have been free. But the strangest thing about blood justice is this: once it starts flowing, it never truly stops. And the snow in Montana seemed to drink it in like thirsty earth. Bannack tries to sleep again. After Henry Plummer's hanging, Bannack was quieter, at least for a time. Miners worked their claims again, women swept their porches, children played in the frozen streets. The gallows stood empty, a black skeleton against the sky, but its shadow never left the town. Every man in Bannack had seen it, the final look in Plummer's eyes. Some swore it was fear. Others swore it was hate. A few whispered it was something worse, a curse. Old-timers said they heard him mutter with his last breath, "This town will choke on its own rope." And in the weeks that followed, Bannack began to wonder if the devil's sheriff had spoken the truth. The Vigilantes become the law. The Vigilance Committee, once the heroes of the miners, now walked the streets like an army. They carried rifles, pistols, ropes. They called themselves protectors, but some townsfolk noticed their voices had changed. "You look cross-eyed at a vigilante," one miner muttered, "and you'll find yourself at the end of a rope before sundown." Men who had once cheered them now looked away when they passed. Bannack was safer, yes, but it was also colder, darker. Justice had no trial anymore. It was decided in whispers, in secret meetings, in lantern-lit barns. And every time a new body swung from a beam, mothers asked the same question: how many more hangings before Bannack feels free? The hanging tree. It was the tree on the edge of town that carried the most fear. Not the gallows, not the sheriff's office, just a gnarled old cottonwood that the Vigilantes chose for speed. By night, the branches groaned with the winter wind. By day, miners swore they saw shapes still hanging, twisting in the light. One boy claimed he saw Henry Plummer himself, swaying gently, his shadow stretching across the snow. When he screamed, his mother scolded him. But others admitted, in hushed tones, that they too had seen the sheriff on stormy nights, badge gleaming faintly on his chest. The Vigilantes cut down bodies fast, but the tree always seemed to whisper. Strange deaths begin. Soon after, the accident started. One vigilante, strong as an ox, was found drowned in Grasshopper Creek. No one knew how he'd fallen in, his face twisted as if in terror. Another was thrown from his horse when the animal suddenly reared, eyes wide at something unseen in the road. A third was discovered in his cabin, rope burns around his neck, but no rope in sight. His wife swore she heard footsteps that night, boots on the floorboards, a chair scraping across the room, and then silence. Whispers spread. Plummer is taking them back, one by one. The widow's warning. One evening, an old woman arrived in Bannack. Some said she was a traveling healer, others swore she was Plummer's widow, though no record of such a woman existed. She wore a black shawl, her face lined with years, and her voice carried like a church bell. She told the Vigilantes plainly, "You think you've buried him, but you haven't. A man like Henry Plummer don't stay in the ground. You've built your law on blood, and blood will call to him until you're all swinging." The Vigilantes laughed, but the townsfolk didn't. For in her words, they heard the truth of what was already happening. Shadows in the jailhouse. The sheriff's office, now abandoned, became a place of dread. Windows were nailed shut, doors barred, but still, strange noises came at night, chains rattling, boots pacing, muffled voices from beneath the floor. A group of miners dared each other to enter. They swore the air inside was freezing, colder than the winter wind. In the corner of the office, the star badge lay on the floor where it had been thrown. One man picked it up. The others watched in horror as his hand blistered instantly, like he had grabbed hot iron. He threw it down, screaming. The badge spun across the wooden floor, and in that moment, all of them heard it, a deep, hollow laugh, echoing through the walls. They fled. Bannack's curse grows. The more the Vigilantes hanged men, the more the town feared them, and the more the ghost stories spread. Stagecoach drivers refused to travel after dark. Prospectors swore they saw a rider on the ridges, tall in the saddle, with a dark hat pulled low, watching the town with burning eyes. One miner, half mad with drink, shouted in the saloon, "Plummer still runs Bannack. Only now he wears no flesh, only shadow." They dragged him outside, but his words clung like frost on glass. A town afraid of its own justice. By spring, Bannack was split. Some begged the Vigilantes to stop the hangings, fearing they were feeding Plummer's curse. Others demanded more, believing only by killing every outlaw could the town be safe. But the truth was clear: Bannack was no longer a town of miners. It was a town of ghosts, of ropes, of fear. And in the darkest hours of the night, when the snow was gone and the earth was wet, townsfolk swore they could hear it: the creak of gallows wood, the whisper of rope, and the voice of a sheriff long dead. "I am still the law." Closing cliffhanger. The Vigilantes thought they had ended the reign of Henry Plummer. But the curse of Bannack was only beginning. And as the graves grew, so too did the shadows of doubt. Had the Vigilantes saved the town, or doomed it to a haunting no justice could ever silence? Checkmark next. In Part 7, we'll descend even deeper into Bannack's chilling legend, the Vigilantes, paranoia, the ghostly riders, and the line where history and horror blur into one. Would you like me to make Part 7 lean more toward vigilante paranoia and real historic bloodshed, or more toward full horror, ghostly apparitions, supernatural terror? Part 7: Riders in the Dark. Hook. They thought they killed a man. But Henry Plummer was more than a man. Some said outlaw, some said sheriff, but by the spring thaw of 1864, Bannack whispered another name for him: Revenant. And when the riders came at night, no one knew if they were vigilantes or spirits, or something worse. A town divided. By now, Bannack was no longer the boomtown of its first gold rush days. Miners had dug deep, pockets of gold were harder to find, and hunger gnawed at the men who once dreamed of riches. The Vigilantes still held their ropes ready, but their unity was cracking. One half believed they had to keep hanging suspected outlaws, to prove Bannack was no place for thieves. The other half muttered that every noose only brought another shadow into the streets. In the saloons, arguments broke out. Some cursed Plummer's name, others lowered their voices and spoke of him like a storm, something you didn't tempt by saying aloud. The first rider. It was a stagecoach driver who swore he saw him first. One clear night, heading toward Virginia City, he spotted a lone horseman riding alongside the cliffs. The man was tall, wearing a long black coat, and his hat was pulled low so his face couldn't be seen. But what froze the driver's blood wasn't the shadowed face, it was the sound. The rider's horse made no noise. No hoofbeats, no snorts, no breathing. Just silence. When the driver blinked, the figure was gone. By the time he reached Virginia City, his hair had turned white at the edges. He refused to drive the night roads ever again. The Vigilantes turn on themselves. Meanwhile, inside Bannack, the Vigilantes were unraveling. Captain Wilbur Fisk Sanders, one of their leaders, began to suspect that traitors lived among them. Plummer had men everywhere, he reminded them, and his ghost don't frighten me as much as the living snakes in this town. But not everyone agreed. Some vigilantes whispered that Sanders himself had blood on his hands, too eager to stretch rope, too quick to accuse. Soon, meetings once filled with courage were filled with arguments, threats, and the cold scrape of knives on belts. The Vigilantes had turned Bannack into a haunted town, and now, they were starting to haunt each other. The widow returns. One stormy evening, the same old woman who had warned them before appeared again at the saloon door. She seemed older now, her shawl dripping with rain, her eyes like burning coals. "They hang their neighbors, and they think the curse will end," she rasped. "But listen to the wind. He rides it. He rides every night." The drunken men laughed, but in the silence after her words, a sound filled the saloon that none could deny: the faint creak of saddle leather, the hollow clink of spurs. The men rushed outside. Nothing. Only the empty street, wet with rain. But from the edge of town, where the hanging tree loomed, came a single whistle, low, mournful, the kind Henry Plummer used to give his deputies before a job. A miner's dream. Not all stories came from sober men. Some came from fever and whiskey. One miner, half dead with pneumonia, swore he dreamed of Bannack burning. He saw the vigilantes hanging not outlaws, but children and women, their eyes black as coal. And in the middle of it all stood Sheriff Plummer, smiling, his star badge glowing like fire. The miner begged the doctor to write it down. It wasn't a dream, he insisted. It was a warning. The doctor laughed, but later, when he passed the jailhouse, he claimed to see smoke curling from under the door, though the building was empty. The riders multiply. By summer, more men began reporting the ghost rider. Not just one, but a group, 3, sometimes 5, silent figures on the ridges. Always at dusk, always watching. Travelers swore the riders followed them for miles, their faces hidden, until the lantern light of Bannack or Virginia City appeared. Then the figures would fade into the night, leaving behind nothing but the smell of iron and smoke. Some miners began leaving town altogether. Gold ain't worth rope-burned nights, one man muttered as he packed his mule. Justice or terror? The vigilantes still hanged men. 2 more accused thieves were strung up under the hanging tree, their bodies left swaying till dawn. But the more they killed, the more Bannack felt cursed. Children began waking screaming, claiming a dark man was standing in their rooms. Women reported strange knocks on their doors at night, always 3 knocks, then silence. And men, hard men, with pistols on their belts, confessed they heard whispering in their ears when they walked alone. The voice always said the same thing. I am still the law. The gallows shakes. One night, a windstorm struck Bannack. The gallows, though unused for weeks, began to creak and sway as if invisible weight pulled at the rope. Witnesses swore the noose tightened itself, swinging back and forth, though no man was near. The vigilantes gathered to cut it down, but when they touched the beam, the wood shuddered and cracked with a sound like laughter. Some refused to go near it again. Others spat and swore, but even they avoided walking past the gallows after dark. Bannack's darkest summer. By August, Bannack was a town of whispers. Gold claims were abandoned. The saloons were half empty. Men drank fast, slept little, and carried lanterns even in daylight, as if shadows themselves could kill. And then came the killings. Not hangings, not accidents, but killings no one could explain. A vigilante found with his throat cut in his own bed, door still locked from the inside. A deputy's body discovered in Grasshopper Creek, his chest caved in as if trampled by hooves, though no tracks marked the bank. And one morning, the blacksmith's boy swore he saw Sheriff Plummer himself standing outside the jailhouse, hat in hand, watching the sun rise. When he blinked, the figure vanished. But on the ground where it stood lay a boot print, fresh, heavy, and pressed deep into the dirt. Closing cliffhanger. The vigilantes had killed Henry Plummer to save Bannack. But now, Bannack wasn't just haunted by his ghost, it was drowning in fear, suspicion, and death. And the riders in the dark were growing bolder. Soon, Bannack would learn, the dead don't forgive, and justice bought with rope comes at a price no town can pay. Checkmark next in part 8, the story will dive into Bannack's night of reckoning, when the vigilantes themselves start vanishing, and the town must face whether it's haunted by guilt, or truly hunted by the sheriff's ghost. Do you want part 8 to lean more into bloody vigilante paranoia and betrayal, history-driven, or full ghostly terror with supernatural hauntings, horror-heavy? Part 8 Night of Reckoning. Hook. The men of Bannack thought they held the noose. They thought they controlled fear. But on one August night in 1864, the hangman became the hunted. And from that moment, Bannack was no longer just a mining camp, it was a graveyard waiting to be filled. The vigilantes begin to vanish. For months, the vigilantes had lived like kings. They had strung up Henry Plummer, his deputies, and half a dozen men besides. They ruled Bannack through terror, convinced their noose was the law. But then, one by one, they began to disappear. It started with Elijah Boardman, a known vigilante who had bragged too loudly about stretching Plummer good. He left his cabin at dawn to fetch water. He never returned. Later that day, His boots were found standing neatly on his porch, still warm but empty. The next week, another vigilante vanished while escorting a prisoner to Virginia City. Both men, vigilante and prisoner, were gone, but the horse came back riderless, reins dragging, eyes wide with terror. By September, 7 men had vanished. No bodies, no trails, no answers. The town turned silent. Bannack had always been rough, a place of pickaxes, gunshots, and drunken laughter spilling into the dirt streets. But now silence ruled. Miners no longer worked their claims past dusk. Children no longer played in the creek. Even the saloons closed early, their doors barred before the moon rose. And over it all, men swore they heard horses moving through the night. No hoofbeats, no snorts, just the faint jingle of bridles, circling the town, waiting. The hanging tree speaks. One autumn night, the wind rattled the hanging tree at the edge of town. The vigilantes, half drunk, gathered there to prove their courage. "Plummer's gone," one shouted. "The dead don't ride." But before the words could leave his lips, the noose above them swung wildly, twisting tight, as though some unseen neck had dropped through it. The tree groaned, the rope stretched, and then snapped in half, whipping across the ground. The men fled, but later, when the morning sun rose, the rope had tied itself back together, perfectly knotted, swaying as though it waited. A meeting of fear. The vigilantes called a secret meeting inside the Masonic Lodge. By lantern light, Captain Wilbur Sanders tried to calm them. "We cannot let superstition undo our work," he declared. "This is flesh and blood. Plummer had allies. They're striking back. Nothing more." But another man rose, John X. Bidler, one of the most feared of them all. His face was pale, his voice low. "You can call it flesh and blood, Sanders. But I've seen him. Plummer rides. I swear it. Black horse, black hat, no sound but the creak of saddle leather. He followed me clear to Grasshopper Creek." The lodge filled with whispers. Some called Bidler a drunk. Others believed him. What none of them admitted aloud was this: every man in that room had heard something in the dark. The stranger in the saloon. Weeks later, on a bitter October evening, a stranger walked into Bannack's saloon. Tall, broad-shouldered, coat pulled tight, he ordered whiskey and sat in the corner, saying nothing. The men tried not to stare, but every time the lantern flame flickered, his face seemed to blur, sometimes pale, sometimes shadowed, sometimes almost familiar. When a miner finally asked his name, the stranger looked up, smiled faintly, and tapped the star badge pinned inside his coat. Then he drained the glass, set it down, and vanished through the door. No one followed. The next morning, boot prints circled the saloon, deep, heavy, pressed into the mud. But the prints had no beginning. No end. The last ride of Samuel Holland. Samuel Holland, one of the fiercest vigilantes, swore he'd had enough of ghost stories. "Plummer's dead, and I'll ride these hills till I find who's spreading this devil talk," he barked. That night, he saddled his horse and rode out alone. Men watched him vanish into the timber. He never returned. 3 days later, his horse staggered back into Bannack, foam on its mouth, eyes rolling white. Tied to the saddle was Holland's hat, ripped clean through the crown by a bullet. But the bullet hole was burned black, as though fire had passed through it. Bannack breaks. By November, Bannack was breaking apart. Miners abandoned claims. Families loaded wagons and left. Those who stayed drank heavily, keeping pistols at their side even in church. Mothers braided charms of sage and bone to hang above their doors. Some men carved crosses into their cabin walls. But nothing stopped the night riders. They grew bolder. Lanterns shook as horses passed unseen. Dogs howled and refused to leave their yards. And, one midnight, the blacksmith's wife swore she saw Sheriff Plummer himself standing in the street, hands raised as though blessing the town. By morning, a cross of ash had been burned into the dirt where he stood. A vigilante's confession. In December, one of the vigilantes, half mad with whiskey, confessed in the saloon. "We killed an innocent man," he cried. "Plummer begged us. Said he was no outlaw. Said we were the killers, not him. And we laughed. We laughed while he swung. He tried to say more, but his throat seized. He clawed at his neck, eyes bulging, tongue turning black. Within minutes, he was dead. When the doctor examined him, he found no wound, no poison. Only a deep red line across the man's throat, as though an invisible rope had crushed it. Closing cliffhanger. By winter of 1864, Bannack was not a town, it was a shadow. The vigilantes had become prisoners of their own fear. And still, the riders circled at night. Sometimes one, sometimes many. Silent, watching, waiting. The noose had been their weapon. Now, it was their curse. And soon, very soon, the rope would tighten again. Check mark in part 9, we'll enter Bannack's winter of blood, when the vigilantes face their darkest terror yet, the belief that Henry Plummer himself has returned, not as a man, but as judge, jury, and executioner. Do you want part 9 to lean heavier into historical accuracy, real vigilante paranoia, betrayals, killings, or horror legend Plummer's full supernatural return? Part 9 The Winter of Blood. Hook. By the time the first snow fell, Bannack was no longer a gold camp, it was a ghost camp. The vigilantes who once ruled with rope and pistol now clutched their guns like children clutching toys. Because every night, under the frozen moonlight, they swore Henry Plummer rode again. Snow over graves. The winter of 1864 came early, laying thick snow across the gulches, the cabins, and the very noose that had ended so many lives. But the snow did not cover the fear. Miners found boot prints where no man had walked, pressed deep into the frost, circling cabins, leading nowhere. The tracks stopped suddenly, as though the walker had risen into the air. The vigilantes claimed they heard voices in the wind, low groans, like men choking at the end of a rope. Sometimes the groans carried words. Names. And those names belonged to vigilantes themselves. The first winter death. On December 10th, Thomas Pitt, one of the Bannack hangmen, stumbled into the saloon pale as death. He swore he had seen Henry Plummer in the cemetery, standing over the snow-covered graves of his deputies. I saw him. The star on his chest, black horse, black hat. He called to me. The men laughed at first, until Pitt dropped dead before their eyes, clutching his throat. When they pulled open his shirt, they found a dark rope mark across his neck, deep and raw. But no rope had touched him. Fear spreads like fire. After Pitt's death, the vigilantes began to turn on each other. They accused one another of bringing the curse. They whispered that some had been wrongfully hanged, that innocent men had swung while the guilty sat in judgment. At night, cabins locked early. Guns were left loaded by bedsides. Men began carving crosses into doors, hanging horseshoes above windows, anything to keep the night riders away. But the riders still came. Children claimed they saw shadowy horses moving through the streets. Women heard boots on porches, hands scraping at doors. And always, from the gallows tree, came the sound of creaking rope, even when no rope hung there. The Masonic Lodge fractures. In January, the vigilantes held another meeting in the Masonic Lodge. Sanders tried to keep order. This is hysteria, he barked. Plummer is dead. We hanged him ourselves. But Beidler, wild-eyed, stood up. You hanged him, but you didn't kill him. He's here. He's riding Bannack every night, calling us one by one. Pitt is proof. The room erupted. Some shouted for prayer, others demanded more hangings, to finish the work. But one older miner, silent until then, muttered, "You can't hang a ghost." The men stared at each other, the lantern light flickering across faces lined with fear. For the first time, the vigilantes were no longer united. They were hunted. The widow's curse. Around this time, another story spread through Bannack. Sarah Hart, widow of one of the men hanged by the vigilantes, was seen wandering the cemetery at night, whispering over the graves. Some swore she was a witch, calling the dead to rise. Others said she had bargained with Plummer's spirit to curse the town. One night, a vigilante tried to confront her. The next morning, he was found hanging from the very tree he had once used for others, his face twisted in terror, his boots frozen to the ground. The widow disappeared soon after. No one saw her leave. No one saw her again. The night of 20 hooves. On a bitter January night, the townsfolk were shaken awake by a sound that rattled every cabin, hoofbeats. Not one horse, not two, but many, 20 hooves pounding the frozen ground in unison, circling Bannack again and again. Men rushed outside with rifles, but the street was empty. The hoofprints appeared in the snow, yet no riders were seen. By dawn, the hoofprints led to the hanging tree. Beneath its bare branches, 20 sets of prints ended. Waiting. The judge's return. Weeks later, as February came, an even more chilling tale took hold. A group of miners traveling home late claimed they saw a figure seated at the judge's bench in the empty Bannack courthouse. A lantern glowed inside, though no fire burned. The figure was Sheriff Henry Plummer, his face half shadow, half bone. He sat silent, one hand on a ledger book, the other resting on a noose coiled neatly at his side. When the men approached, the lantern blew out. And when they rushed in, the courthouse was empty. But the ledger lay open, names scrawled inside. The first names were the vigilantes who had already died. Beneath them, fresh names had been written, living vigilantes who had yet to meet their fate. The killing cold. By March, Bannack was unraveling. More vigilantes fell, some froze to death feet from their cabins, though fires still burned inside. Others were found in the creek, eyes open, lungs full of icy water, though no one heard them scream. It seemed the curse was not only Plummer's hand but the land itself. Bannack's earth had turned against those who spilled blood upon it. And yet, not all were ready to give up. Some still clung to pistols, whiskey, and the hope that daylight could drive the shadows back. But daylight was growing shorter. The nights seemed longer, darker, colder. Closing cliffhanger. By the end of that winter, the people of Bannack whispered openly. Henry Plummer had returned, not as man, not as lawman, but as judge, jury, and executioner. And the final judgment had not yet come. For in the lodge, in the saloons, in every corner of Bannack, one question hung heavier than the snow itself. Whose name would appear next in Plummer's ledger? Check mark in part 10. The finale will bring the curse to its peak. The final reckoning where Bannack either escapes or falls forever into Plummer's grasp. Do you want the last part 10 to end with Bannack completely cursed forever, a dark ending, or with a glimmer of survival hope more balanced for audience? Part 10. The Final Judgment. Hook. Every town has a last sunrise. For Bannack, it came in the spring of 1865. Snow melted, but fear did not. Shadows grew longer even in daylight, and the people whispered that the end had arrived. Sheriff Henry Plummer was riding for his final reckoning, and no soul in Bannack could escape. The Ledger of Death. By April, the story of Plummer's ledger had spread through the gulches. More vigilantes had been found dead, their names scratched into that ghostly book inside the courthouse. Some men swore the handwriting was Plummer's, the same loops and sharp letters he had once used to sign warrants. When the last surviving vigilantes dared to gather, they brought the ledger to Sanders. He touched it only once, then recoiled. The ink was still wet, though no hand had written. The final page was blank, except for 3 words, burned into the parchment as though by fire itself. Judgment is here. The final vigilante meeting. The Masonic Lodge held one last meeting. Lanterns flickered, wood cracked, and the air smelled of iron, like blood warming in the spring thaw. We must leave Bannack, Sanders urged. This town is cursed ground. If we remain, it will bury us all. But Beidler slammed his fist on the table. His face was thin, his eyes sunken, but his voice carried rage. We made this town with rope and gun. We won't run from shadows. If Plummer comes for us, we'll meet him as men. The room divided. Half wanted to flee, half wanted to fight, but the decision was made for them. For as they argued, the sound of hoofbeats shook the lodge walls. The riders return. 20 horses. 20 riders. The vigilantes burst into the street, rifles raised. But their barrels dropped one by one as they saw the sight waiting for them. The riders were the hanged men of Bannack. Their faces purple, necks stretched, eyes bulging. Ropes still swung from their necks, trailing behind like broken banners. And at their head rode Henry Plummer. His sheriff's star glowed like fire on his chest. His eyes were empty hollows. Yet his voice carried, deep and cold. You judged us. Now the earth judges you. The horses circled the Vigilantes. Frost rose from their hooves, though the snow was gone. Guns fired, but bullets passed through. The air grew colder, and the town seemed to sink into silence. Bannack's night of fire. The haunting did not stay with the Vigilantes alone. Cabins burst into flames though no torches touched them. Women screamed as doors burst open and unseen hands dragged men into the street. Children swore they saw skeletal horses watching from alleys. Bannack became an inferno of terror, flame and frost together, fire consuming wood while ice spread along the ground. The living and the dead shared one night, bound together in judgment. The hanging tree claims its own. One by one, the remaining Vigilantes tried to flee. Some ran toward the gulches, others toward the river. None made it far. Each was found hanging the next morning, from trees, from rafters, from beams inside their own cabins. Not a rope in town was left unused. The great hanging tree in the center of Bannack bore the heaviest burden. There, Bidler himself swung, eyes wide, lips twisted into a scream that had never escaped. The man who had believed himself Bannack's avenger became Bannack's final victim. The widow returns. As dawn broke, survivors claimed to see a figure at the cemetery. Sarah Hart, the widow who had cursed the town, stood among the graves. She raised her hands as if to command, but instead of words, a silence fell. The riders, the gallows men, the sheriff, they all faded into mist, sinking into the ground as though the earth had swallowed them. The fire died. The frost lifted. Bannack fell still again. But before she vanished, Sarah Hart spoke one sentence to those watching. Bannack will never be free. Bannack abandoned. In the months that followed, Bannack emptied. Miners packed up and moved to Virginia City, Helena, anywhere but the cursed gulches. Those who stayed whispered of hoofbeats at night, of voices calling names in the wind, of lanterns glowing in the courthouse when no man was inside. The cemetery grew, but the town did not. Bannack became a skeleton of itself, a place where time stopped in 1865. And even today, they say the hanging tree creaks at night. The courthouse door swings open though no wind blows. And if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of a judge's gavel striking wood. Closing. The final judgment. Henry Plummer's body still lies in Bannack, beneath the soil he once ruled. But his spirit rides, not as sheriff, not as outlaw, but as judge. And Bannack itself is his courtroom. The miners, the Vigilantes, the widows, the innocents, they were all part of his trial. A trial that never ended. For the town of Bannack carries its curse to this day. And perhaps that is the truest history of all. When justice is born in blood, it leaves behind nothing but ghosts. Check mark. That completes part 10, the final part, 1000 words, of your Bannack History Horror series. It ends in true liberty of fear style, rooted in American history, soaked in atmosphere, and closed with a chilling permanence.